I'm going to start with making the point that our attitudes towards violence in the modern world, or contemporary sort of secular world, have changed. You might think that this is not the case with some governments and political powers, but even there you will see there is a shift in the rhetoric and framing of discourse that justifies violence in a manner that is more acceptable or suitable to their people, who may reflect or may be more reluctant to accept violent responses to certain issues. So in such a world, religion and its relation to violence, or the discourse about the religious discourse concerning violence, has often been generated in a pre-modern world going back thousands of years. So the challenge here is for the media and for policymakers and the general public is how to engage with that pre-modern tradition in a language that is pre-modern for a time that is modern and debatably secular, or perhaps in a language that is geographically foreign or religiously foreign to us. In today's world, it is Islam or Muslims that are most connected to violence. And there's lots of academic studies on this. Media coverage on the whole about Muslims is overwhelmingly negative. And this othering of Muslims perpetuates a theory of a clash of civilizations, of Islam against the West, two incompatible entities. A note here, the two categories, one is of religion and the other is of a geographical region. Just very quickly, Cardiff University, for example, the research that they've done, there's lots of things you can check on this, for example. They looked at stories published about Muslims between 2000 and 2008, and they found that references to Muslims as radical, as a threat or a problem, outnumbered references to moderate Muslims by 17-1. So when this discourse and the media coverage outnumbers references to moderate Muslims to such a degree, there is a problem in that the diversity within the community is not represented. Now, this diversity also exists within the Islamic tradition itself. Not only that, but if you're looking at differences between particular Muslim thinkers, it requires a more nuanced understanding. One, for example, may find writings that reflect a more hostile attitude towards non-Muslims, written by North African Muslims in the 15th and 16th centuries. But you cannot divorce that from its historical and political context of the fall of Islamic Spain. These scholars addressing Muslims being persecuted or expelled or forced conversion. And religious traditions in general tend to become more insular, defensive, protective in times of defense. And often they, in a negative attitude towards the oppressor, they may also include the religion of the oppressor within that. This does not mean that there is no religious impetus behind these writings. These scholars do belong to intellectual traditions. And the particular school of thought, for example, that they belong to may have led to a harder position towards non-Muslims or Muslim-non-Muslim interaction. So there is a need to discover that dynamic relationship between the political and social circumstances on the one hand and the scholarly heritage of a particular writer that may feed a particular fatwa or religious discourse. Where there is no variance in the Islamic tradition, for example, is on the issue of Muslims who enter non-Muslim lands with a covenant of security. Now, Muslim entering non-Muslim land with a security covenant, it's unanimous among all religious schools that it is impermissible to violate the laws of the land. A Muslim is not allowed to infringe on the property and life of the inhabitants of non-Muslim territory. So there's absolute unanimity among the legal schools on this particular issue. So then what about some of the radical groups that we see operating in the West? Well, this, for example, doctrine that I mentioned that is unanimous amongst the schools shows the religious literacy of these groups is extremely low. or religious illiteracy is not only a concern amongst the media, but also amongst these groups. And I would say that that's a pretty toxic mix when you've got religious illiteracy among extremists and then religious illiteracy amongst the people that are reporting about those extremists. This might surprise, so the next point I'm going to make might surprise some people, that this violence that you are seeing in the modern world among certain Muslim groups is actually very hard to trace that back to any particular religious theological thinkers in Islam who would support the views and activities of groups such as ISIS. Even when you look at some people or scholars that are considered as sort of radical thinkers in the pre-modern Islamic tradition, you'll find that those views of, for example, or those actions committed by groups as extreme as ISIS, you won't find parallels to that in the Islamic tradition. And the closest person you may find is perhaps Ibn Abdul Wahhab in the 18th century, who is the founder of the ideology of Wahhabism that formed the state ideology of Saudi Arabia today. And he condemned, cursed many and scores of Muslims as apostates. Masses of Muslims as apostates, and declared that holy war against them was a religious duty. Having said that, some of those more radical thinkers today, who may have provided theological impetus to groups like Al-Qaeda, even they have distanced themselves and condemned groups like ISIS, saying that their ideology and their activities have absolutely no basis in Islam. And you can also draw parallels between some of these groups. So whilst you may not find exact parallels within these particular groups today and some medieval thinkers, you can find certain issues, for example, in the earliest sects of Islam, the very early sects in Islam, which were referred to as the Kharijites, the Seceders, who had a view that committing a sin or a major sin in Islam took one out of the folds of the religion. And if one went out of the folds of religion, therefore it was a religious duty to wage war against that individual or those groups. So whilst they might not be identical, you can discover certain parallels. So what is needed here then is to trace the intellectual genealogy of some of these extremist groups today and locate them properly within the Islamic tradition, that's in the past, and also in the present. There's a need for distinctions, difference. And here I arrive at another frustration expressed by many Muslims, and that is that such distinctions are either not properly or not often enough acknowledged or pronounced by politicians and also the press. Wahhabis or Salafis are often lumped together with other Sunni Muslims. And you will actually find that the most severe criticisms and condemnations of radical Salafism or Wahhabism are actually made by other Muslims, but that voice is not often heard, both Sunni and Shia, I would say. One has to note that Muslims have suffered by far the most at the hands of these groups. Since the American war in Afghanistan, for example, sources say up to 80,000 Pakistanis have been killed in terrorist attacks. So there is a need to underscore this point about these groups being ideologically attached to certain theological trends within Islam that have actually carried out most of their attacks against other Muslims. But even then, within Wahhabism, within Salafism, there are a variety of ideas and opinion. For example, Salafism or Wahhabism, after the founding of the state of Saudi Arabia, so we're talking about after the person I mentioned before, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, was largely apolitical. But there were certain ideas within Salafism and Wahhabism, certain theological ideas, that were then taken on by certain radical groups that used these ideas then to justify acts of violence that's outside Saudi Arabia, but then also against Saudi Arabia itself. And this is quite interesting because some of these ideas were first used by Saudi scholars, Saudi politicians even, to justify violence abroad in other contexts. But then when it turned against them home, it became a major problem for them. So, the point that I'd like to underscore here is what we need to do is, first of all, be able to trace the intellectual heritage and genealogy of certain radical extremist groups. But that might not be a very simple process, because whilst there may be some continuity, there is also transformation, development, alteration of certain ideas. And then, in the current context, we need to be more mindful of those distinctions that exist among different Islamic and Muslim groups. Very clear, pronounced difference. But often what we find in the media and by policymakers is that many of these are actually lumped together. Thank you very much.